Senate Minority Leader Charles Schumer addressed the American Jewish Committee earlier this week in Washington, D.C. That same event also included two officials from the Obama and George W. Bush administrations debating the merits of President Trump's America First policy. This is just over an hour and a half.
I'm back. I hope you paid attention. I mean, this is really a remarkable achievement that we saw in this video. Under our leadership, 50 governors, Republicans and Democrats alike, joined AJC's Governors United Against BDS campaign. Together, they made a powerful statement. First, that the goals of the BDS movement are antithetical to their values and the values of their respective states. And second, they reaffirmed their support for Israel as an ally, a vital U.S. ally, an important economic partner, and a champion of freedom. I hope you've all had a chance to look at the Wall Street Journal today, which carries a full-page ad naming all of the governors who participated, as well as the mayor of the District of Columbia. And this is a reminder that BDS has been rejected coast to coast. Thank you. AJC continues to work with local, state, and federal legislators. And tomorrow, one of our key advocacy items on the Hill will be support for Combating AIDS Act of 2017, which will protect states that pass anti-BDS legislation. Now, one of the co-sponsors of this act is here with us this afternoon. He's a staunch supporter of the U.S.-Israel relationship, a committed Jewish leader, and actually a longtime personal friend of mine. I'm talking, of course, about U.S. State Minority Leader Senator Chuck Schumer. Chuck has been at the forefront of about every effort to strengthen and deepen the relationships between Washington and Jerusalem. He has also been a strong voice in expressing concern about Iran as a threat to Israel, and like AJC, chose to oppose the JCPOA in 2015. In doing so, Chuck acted out of principle against the wishes of his president and many of his party. We admire his courage then, and we admire his courage now. Now, most of you see Chuck on the TV shows or the front page of newspapers, and he likes being there. But I want to point out that there's another part, how he is committed to his constituencies. This is a man who's not forgotten his roots. He returns to New York every weekend, and over the course of the year will visit all 62 counties because he remembers that these are the constituents that have put him in office. And I'll give you a personal story. A number of years ago, I'm walking across Central Park West, which for those who don't know it is a fairly wide street, and a car comes zooming across and stops right next to me, and the back window goes down, and it's Chuck, and he says, "John, this is the best liverwurst sandwich I've ever had." And he hands me half the sandwich, and then the car drives off, and I'm like in the middle of the intersection with his liverwurst sandwich. So I can tell you that he's not only somebody who, goes to battle for his constituents, he also will give them the food from his mouth. Now, notwithstanding all of these positive comments, I'm supposed to remind you that AJC is fiercely nonpartisan. We do not support candidates, but rather policies and priorities. Now, since I'm told that the most dangerous place in D.C. is between Chuck and a microphone, in an act of self-preservation, it is now my pleasure to welcome to the stage the U.S. Senate Minority Leader, Senator Chuck Schumer.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Let me thank John for that great introduction. John and Shani have been friends of Iris and mine for decades. I've looked to him for advice in international affairs, issues related to Israel, and I know he's doing a great job over the last year as president of AJC. You're lucky to have John at the helm. Another good friend of mine, Stanley Bergman, was John's predecessor. Harriet Schleifer is now the board chair of the Board of Governors. David Harris is amazing and has done this great job for decades. Thank them all. And a relative, my mishpucha, Milton Cooper, is active through marriage. Would have been nice if I was a direct descendant, but no such luck. And I want to praise him as well. Now, as you know, I always like to start off by telling a story. And this one, some of the New Yorkers have heard it, but most of you have not, so I'll tell this story. It's about, it goes under the category, I've never met you in person. In 1992, I was a congressman, and as I was redistricted from Brooklyn to a district partially in Brooklyn, partially in Queens. I see Nita Lowy here. Hi, Nita. She's heard this story. So I was campaigning in Queens to meet my constituents, and a woman comes over to me and says, "You're Congressman Schumer." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I read in the Queens Tribune you're my new congressman." I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "I'd like to pay you a compliment. I've never met you in person, but I watch C-SPAN religiously, and you have more courage than any other member of Congress." I said, "Well, ma'am, that's a pretty tall statement. There are 435 members of Congress. Some of them are no-goodniks, but most are very estimable people. What makes you say I have more courage than any of the others?" And she said, "Well, look, I watch C-SPAN religiously, even though I haven't met you in person, and every time you rise to your feet to speak, you have the courage to wear a yarmulke." I said, "Thank you very much, ma'am. It's obvious you haven't met me in person. It's not a yarmulke." I love these stories. Do I have time for one more, John? Okay, this is another story. You cannot tell most of these in Ogdensburg. So before an AJC crowd, it's very good. So this was when I was first sworn in as a member of Congress. And my whole family came down and were waiting in the anteroom to be sworn in by then Speaker Tip O'Neill. And my grandmother of blessed memory grabs Tip O'Neill, and as was her wont, I forgot the beginning of it. I haven't told this one in a while. My grandmother, my given name is Charles, but we had an Uncle Charlie on my father's side who my mom didn't like. So she said, if you want to name him Charles, he can't be Charlie, he is Chuck. My mother is tomorrow will turn 89. My dad will turn 94 on Flag Day, knock wood. But in any case, so she always calls me Chucky. Even now, you know, she's follows politics. Chucky, why aren't you doing more of this? But my grandmother would always call me Chuckin' you, which I think in Yiddish means little Chucky. I don't know what it means, but that's what I thought. Hope it doesn't mean something worse. In any case, so she grabbed Tip O'Neill, as was her wont, and began to tell them her life story. And she said, we were born in the little town of Chortkov in Galicia, but the egg business went bad, so we moved to America. But after each little vignette, she'd say, take good care of Chuckin' you. And she said, and she came to America, and they had no money, and she would walk 3 miles to save a nickel car fare to work in the sweatshops. Take good care of Chuckin' you. She had 3 beautiful sons, she said. They all fought in the war, and none of them ran away, she said. This is what she said, because they were breastfed. Take good care of Chuckin' you. And now her grandson is being sworn in. You know, said her son Abe didn't go to college, and her grandson is being sworn in as a congressman of the United States. What a great country we have. Take good care of Chuckin' you. Okay. I go out on the floor, I'm sworn in, we go out to dinner and celebrate, the family all goes home, and it's my first day. And I'm sitting at my desk, and I don't really know what to do, and the phone rings. And someone calls up and says, "My name is Leo Deal. Speaker O'Neill wants to see you immediately." I said, "Oh boy." It was sort of like the first day of school and you're already called into the principal's office. What did I do wrong? So I rush over, I'm in Tip's anteroom, my knees are knocking, and finally Tip, who was a lovely man, comes over to me and says, "Charles, I very much enjoyed meeting your entire family, especially your grandmother, but answer for me one question. What is a chuck in you and how do we take care of it?" He thought she was lobbying on some issue or other. Okay. First, on a far more serious note, the horrible, horrible attacks in London over the weekend, another reminder that the global community faces global threats to the values and the principles we've long cherished. We will only be able to confront and ultimately beat back these threats by working together, standing shoulder to shoulder. And the one other point I'd make, the whole world has experienced the horror of terrorism, but 30, 40 years ago, it was only Israel that experienced it. And the rest of the world didn't pay too much attention, and it grew and grew and grew. We can never make that mistake again wherever terrorism rears its ugly head. So first, let me talk about something we're all troubled and worried about, and that is the rising tide of anti-Semitism around the world. It seems that every time we think for a moment we've entered a more enlightened era of tolerance, that age-old demon, anti-Semitism, rears its ugly head again, comes back with a new virulence. Over the past 5 years, we have watched almost with astonishment and disbelief the specter of anti-Semitism rise again in Europe, where it seems to live in the soil as their original sin. I once expressed to the President, I was talking about our disagreement on the Iran deal, and one of my objections was that the Europeans had too much say. And I sort of explained to him that it's sort of deep in the bones in too much of Europe to be anti-Semitic, and it leads to a lack of sympathy for Israel. Now we have seen neo-Nazi gangs in the streets of European capitals, far-right politicians running on platforms that openly promote hostility towards Jews and other religious minorities. And European Jews these days don't feel safe sending their children to Jewish day schools, buying groceries at the local kosher market, going to synagogue on Shabbat. The rise of anti-Semitism in Europe is an outrage. It ought to be condemned by the leaders of the world and of every faith and every nationality. Anti-Semitism always simmered just a bit beneath the surface in Europe, as I mentioned. It's been far more troubling to see that scourge emerge in America in recent months. Earlier this year, it felt like almost every day we saw new reports of synagogues graffitied with swastikas, Jewish cemeteries vandalized, desecrated, and waves of bomb threats to our Jewish community centers and day schools. It seems the darkest, most hateful fringes of our society, from the far right to the far left, have become newly emboldened. We simply cannot stand for this. We have to continue to bring the perpetrators of these heinous acts to swift justice. We must continue to speak out and show those who traffic in hatred and bigotry that we will not abide. And I really want to compliment AJC. You've been tireless on this front. Your initiatives like Mayors United Against Anti-Semitism, the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, launched by AJC and the Islamic Society of North America. I had a meeting with the council leaders earlier this year. It was just great. Shows what we must do. Together, join together, and fight back against all forms of hate. I've worked hard to push the federal government to do everything in its power to combat these threats, wherever they may arise. In March, at my urging, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, announced that Jewish community centers and other at-risk organizations had been granted special emergency waivers that make it much easier for law enforcement to access caller ID information to track down and prosecute these criminals. Technology allows them to hide it, but law enforcement has the tools to get behind it. The FCC had to give them permission. Just recently, Congress allocated $25 million for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which provides nonprofits and religious organizations with the resources for emergency preparedness. The money saves lives. I'm proud to say, bipartisan. We increased the funding this year to new highs. Nita Lowey played a big role in that as well. International efforts like by groups like you, continued leadership from the United States is the only thing we have, but it works to extinguish this hatred. We just have to keep working diligently. We can't give up. We can't shrug our shoulders. We have to keep working. On BDS, John mentioned the great ad that I read this morning on the shuttle coming down that was a culmination of a great deal of hard work of what you have done. Now, the vile attacks I mentioned before are so despicable and they're motivated by hate. The anti-Semitic aspect can't be ignored. But sometimes anti-Semitism is cloaked, hidden by certain movements that profess no bias, but suspiciously hold Israel and by extension the Jewish people to a different standard than others. There's no greater example than this insidious effort to harm the Jewish state than through the boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. The global BDS movement is a deeply biased campaign aimed at delegitimizing the Jewish state, and its supporters, sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly, but all of them practice a modern form of anti-Semitism. And we have to call them out for that. I want to tell you a little story. When I was a college student, the SDS, which was the sort of left-wing radical movement, but it switched. It's moved from free love and smoke pot and have hair down to your shoulders and all that stuff. Wear bell-bottoms. Anyone here remember what bell-bottoms were? They're probably coming back and I didn't even notice, but anyway, they switched and they were taken over by a hardcore group. And one of their campaigns was against the state of Israel. There shouldn't be a Jewish state. It's Zionist imperialism. And so I was active in both the Harvard Young Democrats and in Hillel, and we invited Abba Eban to come speak. And 2,000 people gathered in the big auditorium there called Sanders Theater, and the SDS PLP was in the balcony, and they had their banners, Stop Zionist Imperialism, Free Palestine, whatever. Eban, in his Etonian tones, which I will not try to imitate at the request of my staff. I would love to do it. John was right, what he said. But he pointed to them, and he said, I want to tell you something, you up there in the balcony. I said, for centuries, there has been a double standard that affects Jews. The Jew was allowed to be a farmer. No, a Jew was not allowed to be a farmer. Everyone else was. The Jew could not live in Moscow. Everyone else could. The Jew could not do this, that, or the other thing. And he said, you, in the balcony, when every other people gains their nationhood, you applaud. And he named a few countries, I think. When Sri Lanka or Zambia or Paraguay becomes an independent country, you applaud. There is only one group of people that you criticize, that you attack when they become a nation, and that is the state of Israel. You, he said, are anti-Semites. They slinked away. They picked up their banners, and never in the last few years that I was at college did the SDS-PLP attack Israel again. That kind of calling out BDS for what it is very, very important. because the double standard exists today with them. BDS condemns Israel. They seek to impose boycotts solely on the Jewish state, but willfully turn a blind eye to nations that actually violate human rights. When Iran sponsors terror and executes dissenters, BDS is quiet. When Arab nations jail journalists, punish homosexuality with prison sentences and physical abuse, BDS is nowhere to be found. And that's because the state of Israel is all too frequently measured by a different double standard than the rest of the world. It's up to us to fight these efforts tooth and nail. They're not only unjust and immoral, they're counterproductive in achieving a truly lasting peace between Israel and the Palestinians. So again, you deserve a huge round of applause for what you did with the governors. Our state of New York has passed a law that says if your business or university boycotts Israel, then New York will boycott you. Just last week, Nevada did the same. We should call on every governor of every state to pass the same exact law. On the 50th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem, let's be clear that many BDS supporters have the same goal as the armies that amassed on Israel's border to annihilate the Jewish state. But make no mistake, as we defeated them, the BDS supporters will be defeated as well. Another place where cloaked anti-Semitism lurks is in the halls of the United Nations. The UN singles out Israel more than any other nation, especially in the Human Rights Council, which remains hell-bent on admonishing the only beachhead of democracy and representative government and equal rights in the Middle East. I was heartened to hear the new Secretary General recently say he would be on the front lines in the fight against anti-Semitism. He proclaimed that Israel must be treated as any other state in the UN. And just last week, Danny Danon was elected Vice President of the 72nd session of the UN General Assembly. That's progress. AJC played a role in that as well. And your continued engagement as a group with UN officials in Turtle Bay is very important. At the UN, we can never let our guard down. Since the days of Zionism is racism, the UN has been an incubator for Israel bashing, a forum where Israel is almost always the villain and never the victim. We should all be wary of it. I hope that one day it'll happen. Israel will come to be treated fairly in the UN. But until that day comes, the US must always come to the aid of our friend Israel at the UN. It must continue to serve as a bulwark against smear campaigns and efforts to isolate Israel. We can't be silent when the UN singles Israel out for condemnation. The United States should have vetoed Resolution 2334 in December, and it should never use the United Nations as a forum to put pressure on Israel of any kind. Iran. Finally, an engaged America is particularly important when it comes to Iran, which continues to sow instability throughout the region. The regime continues to provide support to its proxies in the region, conduct ballistic missile tests, flagrantly abuse the human rights of its own people, and unjustly imprison foreigners. We must work with our partners in the region to counter Iran's malign activities, and especially hold their feet to the fire on compliance with JCPOA. As John mentioned earlier, I didn't support it, but it passed. I don't think we should now violate this agreement. We should be in watchful waiting to see what happens. It is, however, incumbent upon us to remain vigilant and watch Iran like a hawk outside of the JCPOA. Their provocative missile tests, their sponsorship of terrorism, their human rights abuses are outrageous. It is imperative in the Congress we act in a bipartisan way to counter this behavior and keep that regime in check. My friends, the challenges before us are great. Anti-Semitism at home and abroad, nefarious campaigns leveled against Israel at the UN and in the form of the BDS movement, calls for a new brand of isolationism that would leave the United States less able to confront and combat each of those threats and many more beside. The only way we can protect the progress we've made, defend our friends and allies, including Israel, and continue to work towards a more peaceful and prosperous world is if America leads. When the world cannot trust America to live up to its commitments, that unsettles our allies and emboldens our adversaries. When America does not stand up for human rights and democratic principles beyond our borders, that weakens our fidelity to those values within our borders. The world has been a better place, my friends, when America is a beacon for freedom and tolerance, when people around the world continue to look up to the lady who holds the torch in the harbor in the city in which I live, when economic and social advancement is a goal for all peoples. America has always been a better country when we embrace that role. What would it mean for Israel and the Jewish people were the U.S. to retreat, to look inward, and disengage from a world that's ever more interconnected and interdependent? The challenges we face will not go away if America closes her eyes for the next 4 years. They'll still be there when she opens them, and they will have grown immensely. So the best thing, I say to you with complete conviction, the best thing for Israel and for Jews world over is a strong, engaged America on the world stage. We must work to keep it that way. Well, the late Shimon Peres once called AJC the foreign ministry of the Jewish people. Your founders believed the Jewish people needed to be masters of their own destiny, no matter where they lived. So they worked hard to engage the world, to forge new relationships, to build bonds with nations and communities worldwide. And they did this while promoting the virtues of pluralism, democracy, human rights for Jews and non-Jews alike. In the spirit of your founders more than a century ago, AJC knows this type of global engagement is the only way to ensure true progress. Today, this approach and your mission are more important than ever. Together, let's continue to make sure America engages the world and fights intolerance wherever it arises. Let's make sure America continues to lead for the sake of the values and the principles we all hold so dear. Thank you, and keep up the good work, everybody. Thank you.
We grew up in a very politically engaged family that was very much part of the Jewish community, as well as the civic life of the city of Detroit. And every Friday night, there was this gathering of whatever Levin family member was available. They had the chicken, and we'd have the wine and the challah and the apple pie. but we would it would go on for hours afterwards, this lively conversation about what was going on in the world. And the theme was to be engaged and to be involved. And whatever the issue was, we would go around the table and everybody was expected to speak. And in the end, it was really all about everybody coming at how we go about repairing the world and how do we protect individual rights and how do we, as a family, be part of that effort.
To me, AJC is a natural progression from what we learned growing up, because what AJC does well is about relationships. The people who you meet at AJC are the people my grandmother would invite to dinner.
Yeah. So AJC felt like family. It felt like coming home to that Shabbat dinner.
And so what we do as an organization is a natural expression of what we learned growing up, which is, though you are a member of your community, your job in the world is to make the whole world better. And that's what AJC does.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome AJC Executive Council member Bobby Lapin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what is my own personal favorite moment of each AJC Global Forum, the annual Great Debate. This year, 2017, perhaps more than any other year in recent times, I think we would all agree has been defined by polarizing and oftentimes painful disagreements in the boardroom, at the Seder table, and beyond. And of course, the AJC Global Forum is no exception. But AJC, of course, is not new to this reality. Every year, we have featured passionate debates about the day's most pressing issues in global affairs. And over time, this segment, the Great Debate, has become an enduring fixture in our Global Forum programming. As many of us, I'm sure, will recall, last year, Democratic Congressman Steve Israel faced off against Republican strategist Dan Senor over which political party best represented American Jewish interests. And the year before, you may recall, we witnessed a rather fiery exchange between two well-known Israeli journalists, Ari Shavit and Caroline Glick, about the future of the two-state solution or the lack thereof. In years past, we have hosted vigorous and memorable contests between Roger Cohen and Bret Stephens on Iran, Yossi Klein Halevi and Peter Beinart on Zionism, and Congressman Barney Frank and last night's guest, Bill Kristol, on the 2012 presidential election. But throughout, our goal here at AJC, of course, has been to foster respectful but spirited conversations between two prominent thinkers who hold very opposite opinions, and that holds true today. In just a minute, we will welcome to our stage today's two debaters, both of whom are good close friends of AJC. On the one side, we will welcome Ambassador Wendy Sherman, the former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs for President Obama and a lead negotiator on the Iran deal. And on the other side, we will welcome MIchael Doran, a former senior director of the National Security Council in the George W. Bush administration and one of the architects of the Bush administration's Mideast policy. So with AJC's own Jason Isaacson serving as our most able moderator, Ambassador Sherman and Mr. Doran will both try to answer the question, the America First approach, is it advancing or is it compromising U.S. interests abroad? So ladies and gentlemen, settle in, fasten your seatbelts, and before we begin, I'd like to turn your attention, please, to the presentation on the screen for a brief video introduction. Thank you.
My foreign policy will always put the interests of the American people and American security above all else. Has to be first.
Candidate Trump promised a foreign policy that would put America first. President Trump's first months in office have the public and pundits asking, is America first more about style or substance?
So I'm looking at 2-state and 1-state, and I like the one that both parties like.
President Trump has signaled a potentially new approach to Arab-Israeli peace, following strains between the Obama administration and Israel. What will this mean for U.S. policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
One of the worst deals I've ever seen is the Iran deal.
Despite blasting the Iran nuclear deal, President Trump shows no sign as yet of voiding the Obama administration's agreement with Tehran. Will this stance change?
We have been very clear to the Assad regime that a red line for us is chemical weapons being utilized.
President Obama drew a red line with Syria on chemical warfare. But it was President Trump, not President Obama, who launched missile strikes against the Assad regime. How will this more muscular posture affect the course of the Syrian conflict?
I committed to resetting the relationship between our two nations.
The Obama initiative to reset relations with Russia faltered as Vladimir Putin challenged his neighbors and expanded Moscow's influence.
It would be wonderful if NATO and our country could get along with Russia. Right now, we're not getting along with Russia at all.
Will President Trump's attempts to set a new course with the Kremlin fare any better? As the debate continues over what President Trump's America First policies mean for the role of the U.S. in the world, one thing is certain: the world is not waiting.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our debaters and moderator, MIchael Doran, Ambassador Wendy Sherman, and AJC's Jason Isaacson.
Good afternoon. In the 4.5 months since his inauguration, at which he promised, quote, "From this day forward, it's going to be only America first, President Trump has put forward policies that seek to reposition the United States on the world stage, asserting that America under his predecessors has been taken advantage of by friends and foes alike. He has taken a series of steps intended to defend U.S. sovereignty and reverse the unfair treatment he believes our country has suffered. The President has withdrawn the United States from one major trade deal and pledged to re-examine 14 others. He has proposed sharp cuts in the State Department and foreign aid budgets. He has lashed out publicly at Mexico, Canada, Australia, and Germany, and in his first NATO summit a week and a half ago, he publicly scolded our closest allies for owing America money for their defense. Last week, the President announced that the United States would pull out of the 196-nation Paris Climate Accord, arguing it would cost our country trillions of dollars, and stating, "I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris." Against this disruptive record, there have also been multiple signs of reassurance that American foreign policy was not so different after all. The President has asserted that NATO is no longer obsolete. He has stuck with the Iran nuclear deal, principally negotiated by Ambassador Sherman, while seeking to intensify pressure on Iran for its dangerous ballistic missile program and its support for terror and subversion. He has made common cause against terrorism with some 50 Muslim-majority nations. He has pledged unshakable partnership with Israel. So I'd like to begin our debate by asking Ambassador Sherman and Mike Doran to define the intentions and implications of President Trump's America First foreign policy, and further to step back from the daily tidal wave of Russiagate news and other distractions and tell us whether the administration is pursuing essentially a course correction in traditional U.S. foreign policy or pursuing what might be described as a disengagement from world affairs. But before turning to our debaters, a quick word about ground rules. Ambassador Sherman and Mr. Doran will each have 5 minutes to speak and then 3 minutes apiece to respond to each other. While they are speaking and while I am then following up with a couple of questions of my own, I'll ask you to write in your own questions on the cards that are on your chairs and pass them to the AJC staff circulating in the aisles. or if you're watching this debate online, tweet your questions to @AJCGlobal. After I pose as many questions as time allows, I'll ask our debaters for concluding remarks, and now we'll begin. Ambassador Sherman.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here today at the AJC Global Forum and to be part of your annual great debate on this very consequential question. Like the New York Times lead editorial said yesterday, I believe that President Trump is leading America in retreat from the world. A dangerous position that cedes control of our future to others, undermines our economic and physical security, and undermines American values. It's important to set America first in its historic context, especially important for all of us who are Jews. As most of you know, America First was the organizational name of the movement in America in the 1930s, led by Charles Lindbergh, among others, to keep America out of World War II. Lindbergh was profoundly anti-Semitic and pro-German, an isolationist and a nationalist. Lindbergh, hero of the skies that he was also someone who wanted to keep out of America those who did not look like him, people who weren't, quote, real Americans. That President Trump adopted this moniker should concern all of us as Jews and as Americans. The echoes of isolationism, building walls, fear of people not like us, and abrogation of human rights are too loud for comfort. The president, as he campaigned, understood there were people hurting in America. Families who lost jobs through technology and trade, who were buffeted by rapid social change and felt unanchored and unseen. His answer was America First, when the answer lies elsewhere. We're at full employment, even if some are underemployed and trying to take care of their kids and college on incomes that stagnated in the wake of the recession. The answer for these families is better job retraining, real trade adjustment assistance, a higher minimum wage, a college loan system that works, and an embrace of the new and future economy. It is not America First in a retreat from the world. Historically, we as a people know better than anyone that closing one's eyes to the world is a recipe for disaster. The Trump administration has, for the most part, tried to disconnect from critical alliances, core American values, and life-saving objectives. Most recently, of course, the president withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, a non-binding commitment by 200 countries to voluntarily reduce harmful emissions to save the planet. Withdrawing from the agreement will not bring back coal jobs, but it will make it harder for us to compete in new technologies. Hopefully, leadership by governors, mayors, and major employers will save us from ourselves and ensure our grandchildren have a future. At the very start of his presidency, President Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, leaving allies and partners to wonder if they should turn to China. Although the president backed off his total castigation of NATO, he hectored our European partners and left them to fend off Russian aggression, following a stop in Saudi Arabia that contained no tough messages. He visited Israel but left unclear his way forward, and of course, he withdrew from the Paris Agreement. The president has offered a budget that reduces the State Department and USAID budget by 31%, while substantially increasing the Defense Department. I want a strong military. The credible threat of force is a critical element of successful diplomacy. But as Secretary Mattis has said, if the diplomacy is gutted, he will have to buy more bullets. Further, Secretary Tillerson, along with the White House, has not filled many of the State Department positions, leaving us leaderless on many, many fronts. Perhaps most concerning is the recent Wall Street Journal op-ed by National Security Advisor McMaster and Director of National Economic Council Cohn. They said the world is not a global community, but an arena where nations, non-government actors, and businesses engage and compete for advantage. As the New York Times said, this is not hard-headed realism, but, quote, a vision of a world of cutthroat competition and zero-sum outcomes deeply at odds with the most cooperative, rules-based vision that has motivated America and its allies since World War II. The Trump administration vision of competition will not allow nations to work together to defeat terrorism, deal with climate change, advance cybersecurity, stop pandemics, reduce poverty, creating middle classes worldwide that create markets for American goods and embrace our values. We believe in the concept of tikkun olam. America should as well. The American Jewish Committee was founded in 1906 to prevent the infringement of civil and religious rights of Jews and to alleviate the consequences of persecution. I know I have 3 seconds, but I'll be fast. As AJC developed, it fought against immigration restriction in the 20s, human rights at the UN in 1945, equality for all Americans in the 50s, fought the boycott of Israel in the 70s and today, and for Soviet Jewry in the 90s, began international engagement in a diplomatic marathon and supported NATO intervention in Kosovo, and in the 21st century, opened a transatlantic institute in Brussels, helped raise money for victims of the South Asian tsunami and Hurricane Katrina, and advocated for energy independence and green policies. I could go on about all AJC has done to engage in the world. Clearly, AJC believes that the United States and its people are a force for global peace and security. AJC has never been an America First organization, nor should our country be.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. Mike Doran, you have an extra 30 seconds.
Oh, thanks. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to the AJC for inviting me. I completely agree with Ambassador Sherman. It's a great honor to be here in this company debating this consequential issue. I do have a slightly different position. I think that the starting point for understanding, the historical starting point for understanding America First is not Charles Lindbergh. As a former educator, I can guarantee you that nobody under the age of 65 in the country remembers Charles Lindbergh and America First, 1% perhaps. I think a better place historically to start it would be March of 2016. I know the phrase predated that, but to understand what it's all about, I think we should go to then. That was when Bernie Sanders defeated Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary. For those of you who've read the book Shattered, the inside account of the Clinton campaign, you know that Sanders' victory completely blindsided Hillary Clinton. She walked around talking to her staff after the events, saying that she was utterly mystified by the behavior of the voters and didn't understand why she wasn't connecting with them. The book also tells you in the really enlightening first chapter that the campaign had a great difficulty at the beginning coming up with an explanation for Hillary Clinton's desire to be president, to explain what it is that why she wanted the presidency. That's after almost a decade of running for president. The book is enlightening about Hillary Clinton, and she is the subject, but really, I think it's a much deeper message to us than just Hillary Clinton or her campaign. It's really a story about the complete disconnect between the Washington elite and the voting public, and I would include in that Ambassador Sherman and myself. I think the last election was a wake-up call for all of us. Our foreign policy elite is not fashioning a message and policies that resonate with the priorities of the American people. And that's what America First means, number one. A foreign policy that resonates with voters and demonstrates to voters that our elite is indeed trying to advance their interests on the global stage. That's the first point. The second point is it is a resounding rejection of the philosophy of the Obama administration. And I would say the absolute failed philosophy of the Obama administration, which was heir to a point of view after the end of the Cold War that, for lack of a better term, I'll call the end of history viewpoint, advanced by Francis Fukuyama. According to this view, our elite decided, especially the Democratic elite, decided that things like alliance, credible use of force, military deterrence, and so on, were outmoded, often counterproductive, and damaging to the United States. And if you doubt me on that, just need to go back and read the UN General Assembly speeches that President Obama gave year after year, where he explicitly explicitly developed this concept, saying things like, we are no longer in an age when one country can dominate another, and so forth. This was a philosophy that led the administration to reach out to enemies and to distance itself from friends. And we saw that in the Middle East, most dramatically in the Iran deal. President Obama's attitude toward the Middle East was that it was an arena populated by friends and potential friends. And he went to a great extent to win over the potential friends like Iran at the expense of our friends, Israel. In order to do this, he had to deceive the Israelis and the American public on a number of areas, with the consequences that we all see now. If I had come to you at this forum in 2013 and told you that the consequence of President Obama's policies was going to be the rise of a Russian-Iranian alliance across the Middle East, the development of an Iranian territorial corridor from Tehran to Beirut, the displacement of 10 million people in Syria, the injection into Europe of millions of refugees, or at least over 1 million refugees. If I told you that Iran was going to emerge from the deal with the right to enrich and reprocess uranium, and that within 10 years it would have a completely unfettered program which the international community would look upon like the program of any other country, that it would be effectively an international law on a par with Belgium, you would have laughed at me, you would have rolled your eyes, and you would have said that this is a completely dysfunctional fantasy. But it's not. It's a reality. And it's a reality that was a direct result of the philosophy of President Obama, which President Trump has rejected. And if you noticed in his trip to the Middle East, thank you. Well, you got to do it a little louder because it wasn't as strong as the other amp was. If you notice in his trip to the Middle East, he was embraced by our allies, by Israel, by Saudi Arabia, with something like euphoria. The Israelis are doing cartwheels in the air right now, and that's what America First means.
Perfect time. My God, I'm looking at the timer here.
Impressive. Very impressive.
Mike, thank you. Wendy, you have a right of rebuttal.
Well, a couple of points. Perhaps you have to be over 65, which I certainly am, to remember Lindbergh. But I think that we all teach every generation never again. And to ensure never again means not closing one's eyes to the world, but rather understanding the world as it is. Yes, the world in many ways got more complicated after the end of the Cold War, because everyone had lined up with one side or the other. And yes, it is true that there are many powers and rising powers, though the United States represents the only superpower in the world at the moment. That's not to say that Russia and China are not trying to become superpowers. China most decidedly and certainly. Putin is trying to reconstruct the Soviet Union in whatever way he possibly can. All of this is true. Iran does engage in malign activities in the region, but imagine how much worse it would be if Iran had a nuclear weapon and could project power into the region and deter our and our allies' actions. Just as a factual matter, reprocessing is not allowed in the Iran deal, and Iran is only allowed extremely limited enrichment under very strict monitoring. And just to sort of get this issue out of the way, which I know we can't entirely, I just want to be clear that what President Obama understood painfully was that Iran knew how to do what it knew how to do. It had mastered the entire nuclear fuel cycle. We could bomb away its facilities. And the president, in fact, commissioned a weapon to do just that, to be able to penetrate the underground facility at Fordo. And we told the Iranians military threat was quite a critical part of any negotiation. But we also understood that if we bombed those facilities, Iran would recreate them within 2 or 3 years and do so underground. We could continue to try to sanction Iran, but those sanctions were beginning to fray, and the only reason that our allies and partners stuck with us, that Japan and Korea and many other countries cut back their oil from Iran, was because we were involved in serious diplomacy. So those sanctions wouldn't have held up, and so we thought negotiations under very strict limits was the best way to go to ensure that Iran never, ever, ever obtain a nuclear weapon. And then my last point, Israel. Israel was part of what we did every single step of the way. I consulted with them on a constant basis, and their technical and professional experts will tell you that at least for the next decade, in their point of view, Israel is safer as a result of the deal than not having the deal. At the end of the day, the Prime Minister made a decision that this was not a good deal for Israel, and I honor him as Prime Minister to make the decision that he believes is best for Israel's security, and I never doubt for one moment that the leaders of country do what they believe is in their best interest, even when I might not agree.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mike, please.
The United States is a very powerful country. It's extremely powerful and it's extremely influential. The sanctions on Iran were not going to fray. They were not going to disappear. They would have remained firm. They had grown from 2005 by the time I got in the White House. That when I got in the White House in 2005, we put that program together. They grew under the Bush administration. They grew further under the Obama administration. And we had our boot on the neck of the Iranians, and we could have collapsed their economy had we decided to do that. President Obama traded very extremely deep and significant, I would say, irreversible concessions by the United States, permanent and irreversible concessions by the United States for temporary and reversible concessions by the Iranians, who have cheated on every deal that they have ever made. This deal did not stop them from getting a bomb. It did not stop their program. It put their program on a glide path to a bomb, and it started a nuclear race in the region, because the other actors in the region, including the Israelis, are not going to wait 10 years to find out if this stopped them. At the heart of this deal was this philosophy that the Democrats in particular came out of, but our elite in general after the Cold War, which is if we just smooth over problems and move them off to one side, they will somehow go away. That we can turn the Iranians into, if not allies, partners in the region. And make no mistake, part of this deal was the deal over the region. President Obama believed that if he got the nuclear deal out of the way temporarily, he would turn Iran into, he could come up with an accommodation with Iran over the region, over Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, and Iran would moderate. That is a failed theory. It's failed right before our eyes, and the consequences have been catastrophic. And those are the consequences that the Trump administration is having to deal with in a much weaker position than it would have been had we never removed the sanctions to begin with. The United States is the United States is a very powerful country, and that means that everybody has to go along with what we do. We are like a CEO in the region standing next to a secretary, saying to the secretary, "How am I doing in my job?" The secretary is always going to say, "You're doing great, sir." The secretary will never say, "You're doing horribly." But that's how everyone in the Middle East felt, and that's why President Trump got the euphoric acceptance, the euphoric acceptance that he got. Make no mistake, there was severe deception of the American people and of our allies over the Iran deal. At every stage in the negotiation, we were told that we were going to get one thing, when in the end we got something else. And to this day, we don't know the exact details of that deal. That is a failed philosophy, and it is the rejection of it that Donald Trump represents, and it's a great corrective to our foreign policy in the Middle East.
Thank you, Mike. I'm fully confident that we could spend the next hour ping-ponging on Iran. Let me move to a different track here, if I may. But I'd like to start with is I'd like to restate something that AJC CEO David Harris said last night after General McMaster spoke to us. He talked about AJC believing in and defending democracy, rule of law, and pluralism. AJC believing in and relying on American global leadership, and AJC believing in and standing by Israel. And I'd like to ask each of you, beginning with you, Ambassador Sherman, how do these three core beliefs of ours align with the President's worldview? Are they consistent with the concept of America first?
Well, clearly I believe he doesn't see them as consistent with his philosophy of America first. And yes, the President went to the Gulf, and yes, he had a good meeting, but clearly didn't bring everyone together because now Egypt, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates have cast a shadow on Qatar and cut off all relations. So we have a long way to go to keep the Gulf countries together. I haven't heard the President talk about democracy at all. And he is gutting our diplomacy and our ability to bring those values around the world. As I said in my opening statement, when you have National Security Advisor McMaster and head of the Economic Council, Cohen, say that we only have competing interests out there, this is not about pluralism. This is not about solving the problems that cross our borders that require a community of countries to come together. And where rule of law is concerned, I feel like I'm just buffeted on a moment-by-moment basis about what, in fact, the President believes about law. When it comes to his non-travel ban, since everyone in the White House, except the President, says it's not a travel ban, and the President continues to tweet endlessly about his travel ban, and says that, in fact, the courts have to hurry up and get this done, and why isn't it done, and castigates his own Justice Department, which I assume he approved, for cutting down the ban to less of a ban that still is probably going to be seen as a ban. I think in part he's trying to get out in front of the Supreme Court, which, although the Supreme Court often supports the President of the United States and defers to that authority, given the checks and balances in our system, clearly the President's concerned this time that may not happen. We've seen, agreed. We've seen the President deride judges and say that they're not important, that because they are of one background or another, they cannot be fair. We've seen the Justice Department tell our mayors that decisions that may have been made to put laws in place and frameworks in place to make sure that civil society is civil are no longer good and will all be reviewed. I come from the city of Baltimore. Baltimore's got serious and tough problems. They have a plan to move forward, and now the Justice Department's telling them they cannot. So rule of law, pluralism, democracy, it's not part of Donald Trump's America First.
Global leadership and standing by Israel.
Excuse me?
Global leadership,
Excuse me?
U.S. global leadership, and standing by Israel.
Leadership. I probably didn't speak to that because it's so apparent to me that the President believes that the United States should only lead inside its own country. What just happened in London is terrifying, appalling for everyone. As Mike Morrell, former acting head of the CIA and deputy at CIA, has said, lone wolf attacks are something we will all probably live with for some time to come. But the President of the United States' response to that was not to embrace what is going on in the leadership of Great Britain and work together. It was rather to attack the mayor of London, not once, but 3 times now, to the point where the Prime Minister of Great Britain has derided that kind of attack. This is a moment when the kind of work that AJC has done and has been a groundbreaker in doing so, to try to say that Muslims, Jews, Christians, Baha'i, Buddhists, we all have to find a way to live together, to ensure that each of our rights are preserved is completely denied by the president. And quite frankly, his anti-Muslim rhetoric really is going to increase the anti-Semitism that Senator Schumer spoke about earlier in this country, because there's always a reaction. And when there's a reaction, it usually comes on the Jews.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mike, thank you.
I agree with the president that I don't want Paris here in the United States. I don't want London here in the United States. We heard from President Obama rhetoric similar to Ambassador Sherman's. And we heard after every attack in the United States and abroad, we heard from President Obama that everyone should live together, and also we should become more resilient. In his interview with Jeffrey Goldberg and, on the Obama doctrine, he discussed how impressed he was with the Israelis that they had learned to live with terrorism. We have to live with terrorism like it's the weather. Meanwhile, President Obama is in Paris signing a completely meaningless climate accord, which is unenforceable.
Oh, please,
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you. Unenforceable and non-binding, except that it calls for the United States and some of the other leading economies of the world to transfer $100 billion a year to the third world. So we're paying the Chinese on a dubious claim that this is actually going to change the weather. So terrorism, we have to live with like the weather, but we're actually going to change. We're going to change the weather. What is the practical outcome of this philosophy? The practical outcome of this philosophy is that France is becoming a country without Jews. We hear never again rhetoric. We heard never again rhetoric from the Obama administration, but we see that daily the French Jews are leaving. Some are going to London, some are coming to the United States, and I was just in Netanya in Israel, which is growing faster than many parts of the country, thanks to the influx of French Jews. We can stand here and we can say that we want everyone to live together, and those are the values we will uphold. But on the ground in the Middle East and in Europe, there are people who are carrying out a lethal campaign to undo us and to undo our values. Now, you may not agree with the approach of Donald Trump, and that's fine. But you have to come up with a practical answer to this practical problem. And standing on podiums like this and extolling values and complimenting ourselves for saying never again is not going to work. And we can see that. We have 8 years of this. And you can see it very clearly. It's time to move past the rhetoric and develop practical policies to defeat the enemy, to kill the enemy. There is an enemy out there, and he wants to kill us. We should kill him first.
Mike, speak to the issue of U.S. global leadership and how the President's America First concepts square with our belief in U.S. global engagement and global leadership.
The critique of America First, that it's a withdrawal from global leadership, is just patently false. This is a fiction created in the aftermath of the shocking defeat of the Democrats. The media and the Democrats have now combined together to depict Donald Trump's America First as chaotic.
Oh, please, people.
As chaotic and as a retreat from global leadership. President Trump's strike on Syria for its use of chemical weapons did more for American deterrence and American leadership in one short 65-hour period than anything President Obama did in his 8 years. And in doing so, it showed up a number of the lies, and I say that, I choose that word very carefully, the lies that the Obama administration told us about Syria. They told us we couldn't strike Syria because of the anti-aircraft defenses they had. They told us for months and months and months after Assad had used sarin gas that they could not determine whether he had used sarin gas. Note that the Trump administration made that determination within 64 hours. Right? So these were excuses. President Obama also told us and repeated it, and Susan Rice told us that the gas deal that he came up with, the poison gas deal that he came up with the Russians, actually rid Syria of sarin gas. It didn't. It didn't, and we knew it. And we knew it, but we continued to say, but the administration continued to say that it did. That is not global leadership. That is global deception in order to protect this failed philosophy that I described before.
Before I go on, I want to remind people, if you would like to provide a question that we can pose to the debaters, write it down on a card. It'll be picked up and passed along to me. Secondly, if you're watching us online, tweet your question to @AJCGlobal. Also, I would like to ask people to be respectful of our debaters, and while I've allowed cheering and clapping, we don't want booing. I think maybe we just have to not react. So let's try to do it that way. But you could clap for me. Thank you very much. So let me try another question, and then perhaps we can open it up to the floor. Mike, you wrote an op-ed for the New York Times last month as President Trump was on his way to Saudi Arabia and Israel that had one particularly memorable line: "The choices in the Middle East are between very bad and much worse." I like that very much, grim as it is. But you were clearly referring to the Obama administration's policies toward allies in the region when you wrote, if I can quote, because actually you just said something very similar, "It is false that our support for our longtime friends is a cause of instability, and that by distancing ourselves from them while reaching out to our enemies, we can make the world a safer place." So I would like to ask Ambassador Sherman to respond to the notion that the administration that you served, Wendy, tilted against our friends. And I'd ask you, Mike, whether some of our European friends might now be feeling some of the same tough love that the president's predecessor meted out to Israel and Egypt.
I think that it is important for any leader of our country to be open to reaching out to anyone that can serve our interests, not through secret back channels before they become an elected official or an appointed official, because that's dangerous for our country. But I do believe that dialogue, being very clear about what we're trying to achieve, is important. I understand that many in the Gulf and Israel felt that President Obama did not engage with them in a way that moved the ball forward. I understand that. And on some policy issues, I didn't agree with the president. I wish he had taken a strike against Syria early on. Many people in the administration did. But I also understand why he didn't, because he was concerned about a slippery slope. He was concerned because we'd spent so many years in Afghanistan and Iraq already. We're going to spend several more years there now, I believe. But he did try to engage. And Secretary Kerry, Secretary Clinton, both of whom I worked very closely, spent hours and hours and hours and hours trying to see whether the United States could play its traditional role of facilitating a peace between the Palestinians and Israel. And again, at the end of the Obama administration, I probably wouldn't have done the UN Security Council resolution, but I was no longer in the administration, and again, I think it was out of a sense of frustration and wanting, in my view, probably not appropriately, to set the table for the next administration. What concerns me now about President Trump is not that he went to Saudi Arabia and met with Muslim leaders of Muslim-majority countries. I think that was a very good thing to do. I think Even an arms deal with Saudi Arabia is something worth considering, and quite frankly, it's following through on plans that Obama had laid out and had begun. So in many ways, it's nothing new. What matters is, what's the strategy? A strike in Syria is a good thing, and I applauded the president for that strike. But what comes next? What is the strategy? And it is not clear to me at all there is a strategy in Israel. Quite frankly, if President Obama had said what President Trump did about settlements, you all would have been protesting outside of the White House. I see no protest by the community against President Trump's comments about settlements. Nothing. Zero. Zip. So I do believe there is a double standard. I think it's an unfortunate double standard. I believe that President Trump believes in action. We see that every morning. He believes in action, but action, a strike, a mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, although they may be worthwhile signals, are not a policy. And then my favorite of all time is Mr. Gorka saying to an interviewer to ignore the president's tweets because that's not policy. This is the president of the United States speaking. The methodology may be different. It may not be an executive order. It may not be an interview with an anchor. But it is the President of the United States, so we should not listen to his words. We should not consider this policy. So when he says travel ban, we should ignore it. When he says that he thinks that the mayor of London is pathetic, we should not take that to heart. This is not a way to lead the greatest country in the world. In my view, yes, we can make America even greater, but we don't have to make America great again. It already is.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mike, getting to the same question, you said a few moments ago that the previous president reached out to our enemies and distanced ourselves from our friends. Are we distancing ourselves from our friends now in Europe?
No, we're engaged in a recalibration in Europe, and it's a continuation of a negotiation that's been going on for a long time. The Bush administration repeatedly, consistently, energetically raised with the Europeans their failure to reach the 2% commitment, 2% of their GDP for defense. The Obama administration also raised it repeatedly, energetically, consistently with the Europeans. I would urge you to go back again and read Jeffrey Goldberg's interview, The Trump Doctrine, in the Atlantic Monthly, where President Obama talks about an anti-free rider campaign discussing our European allies. That interview contains quotes from Obama, derogatory quotes about David Cameron, Sarkozy, about every European leader, basically, except for Angela Merkel. So when I was in the Defense Department in 2007, 2008, and I personally witnessed when Secretary of Defense Gates spoke to a delegation, a high-level delegation of Europeans, and he lectured them very quietly but aggressively and said, the American public is starting to notice that you're not paying for your defense. And this is politically an indefensible position for an American president. We're being nice and we're talking to you like this, but the reckoning is coming. The reckoning is here now. The failure of the Europeans to meet their 2% obligation is simply indefensible. Would I prefer that President Trump raise this issue in a slightly more diplomatic language? I would, absolutely. But you can't defend the position that the Europeans are taking on this. And that's what it is. It's a negotiation. In terms of this America First commitment of the president, the president went to Pennsylvania, went to Michigan, went to Florida, and he said, I hear what you're telling me, that you don't have jobs and that you don't want to see American jobs going abroad and you don't want to see the United States investing in a disproportionate fashion abroad, and that others have to step up as well. The Saudis have done that. Look at the money. The Saudis pledged $300 billion to us in the Trump administration. The Obama administration gave many tens of billions to Iran. right? There's a different philosophy here, and it's going to achieve different results. The Europeans need us. We need the Europeans. I don't want to suggest that for a second that we don't. We need them badly. They are our democratic allies. They're our western frontier. They're our frontier with Russia, our frontier with the Middle East. They're the frontier against Islamic radicalism and so on. We need them, and we need to support them. But they need us more than we need them. And that is the essence of international politics. International politics is indeed what National Security Advisor McMaster and Gary Cohn said in their op-ed. It is a competition. It is a competition, and it's an arena in which we have enemies and we have allies. And the Trump administration has got that one absolutely correct, and it's a great corrective to the Obama administration.
Thank you, Mike.
Quickly. The question is, do you have objectives? Do you have policies? Do you have a way forward?
Absolutely.
Do you have a strategy?
There is a strategy.
To go to NATO, to unveil a memorial to 9/11 at NATO, and to have had in your speech, as we are told by reporters, a recommitment to Article 5, and then pull it at the last minute, when in fact the only time Article 5, which is an attack on one, is an attack on all. The only time Article 5 has ever been invoked, ever, by NATO, was for America after 9/11, so that NATO troops went to and still are in Afghanistan for us. So yes, I want everyone to get to 2%. Everybody pays their dues to NATO's. The 2% is a deepening of defense capabilities. Yes, I want everyone to go to 2%, and you are quite right, Michael. Every administration has pressed in every way they can to make that happen. The question is, do you begin your relationship by hectoring your friends? Is that the best way to move forward? The strongest economic relationship we have is the transatlantic relationship. So how this, in fact, helps the president's agenda to ensure jobs, that is our market. Canada is our market. Mexico is our market, for that matter, is beyond me.
I'm going to make a prediction. I'm going to make a prediction. And remember that in 2013, I did predict that there'd be very dire consequences from not taking action in Syria. I didn't foresee the dystopian results that we got, but I was correct in my prediction. I'm going to make another one right here. I'm going to predict that NATO is going to pony up their 2%. And they're going to pony up because President Trump took this aggressive position. Again, as I said, it's not the way I would have liked to have seen it, but this didn't start, this discussion didn't start in 2017. The discussion started well over a decade ago. And the Europeans have been playing us, quite simply. We don't like to say it to our allies, but they've been coming up with increases that will result in arrival at the 2% in 2024, when nobody who's currently serving in the government is going to be around to hold them to it. And just like we keep buying the same donkey from the North Koreans with their nuclear program, and as we're going to keep buying the same donkey from the Iranians, we keep buying the same donkey from our allies. Our allies whom we support, whom we adore, and who we work closely with. But there's a limit to how much I think that we should take from them on this. As for strategy, make no mistake, Donald Trump is a strategist. You cannot, I hear you.
Please.
I hear you. I hear you. But listen, once again, if I had told you in April of last year that he was going to win the election, I would have gotten a bigger laugh. And he said in the election throughout, here's how I'm going to win. I'm going to win Florida. I'm going to win Pennsylvania. I'm going to win Wisconsin. I'm going to win Michigan. I'm going to bring new voters in. I'm going to capitalize on the kind of people that are voting for Bernie Sanders, and I'm going to pull them into the Republican Party. That's what he said he was going to do, and everybody laughed at it, and he did it. And after he did it, the media and the Democratic Party, don't laugh, you laughed at that before already, the media and the Democratic Party, in order to explain why they got it so wrong, instead of saying, you know what, maybe he's a strategist and I missed that, instead they came up with a cockamamie conspiracy theory about how the Russians handed him the elections. And if you saw
Excuse me, are you saying that the Russians did not interfere with our election?
Handed him the election. Handed him the elections.
Did the Russians interfere with our election?
Let me finish my point, and then I'll answer your point.
I'm glad you did that. I was just about to talk about Russia. Please.
He has a strategy in the Middle East. It's very clear. The strategy in the Middle East begins with the point that the Russian-Iranian alliance is a threat to the United States and to its interests. Unlike the Obama administration, all of the principals in the Trump administration believe that the rise of Iran in the Middle East is a threat to the United States. To the United States and to its ally Israel. The Obama administration did not see it that way. The Germans
That's not true.
do not. The
That's
Germans
simply not true.
The Germans. President Obama, and he says this clearly in his interviews with David Remnick and with Goldberg, was operating under the notion that he could bring about an equilibrium in the Middle East between our allies and the Iranians, which means a moderation of the Iranians, which has not happened.
That is absolutely not true, Michael. I sat in all of those meetings. The President of the United States, President Obama, believed that what he was doing was ensuring that Iran never had a nuclear weapon, that it could never project that power into the region. You may not agree with the deal, I get that. But he always understood the malign activity, their support for Hezbollah and Hamas, and that we had to do everything we could do to stop that.
What steps did he take? What steps did he take to deter the Russians and the Iranians in Syria?
Remember,
what steps did he take to deter the Russians and the Iranians?
The Russians came into this very late in the day, and they came into it.
Qasem Soleimani went to Moscow.
I said Russia.
The minute the JCPO.
Okay, guys.
The minute.
Break, please. Well, we wanted that, so I shouldn't complain. We're moving toward closing remarks, but since I've heard the word Russia mentioned once or twice, let me ask both of you, each of you, to describe how a warmer attitude toward Vladimir Putin, this is a question from the audience, a warmer attitude toward Vladimir Putin's Russia advances American national interests. How does it fit into an America First construct?
Why don't you start?
So it's clear that one of the ideas that President Trump has is finding an accommodation with Putin, particularly in the Middle East, particularly in Syria. It's not one that I happen to agree with, but it's one that's very common among our foreign policy elite on the Democratic side and on the Republican side. But where he differs considerably and significantly in terms of his strategy from the Obama administration is that he believes that he needs to push back against the Iranians across the board, and that was the meaning of the trip to Saudi Arabia and to Israel. Because the Russians and the Iranians are in an alliance, pushing back against the Iranians is pushing back against the Russians. I think the idea, they haven't stated it openly, the idea is to create tensions and to split the Russians off to the extent possible from the Iranians and the Syrians. That also involves reinvigorating our military deterrence, which was completely neglected by President Obama. President Obama had a pathological allergy to military deterrence, and he never engaged in it, almost never engaged in it. Already with the strike against Syria for the chemical weapons, that's the reinvigoration. So there is an outreach to Russia going on, for sure, but it's happening in a completely different context than in which the Obama administration's outreach took place.
Thank you, Mike. Ambassador.
So I obviously have a different point of view. I had, I guess, privilege, I don't know what opportunity, to be with Secretary Kerry in Sochi and meet with Vladimir Putin for about 4 hours. And he can be utterly charming, as I think he was to Megyn Kelly for the last 3 days. But he is KGB, through and through. He is very smart. He is very strategic. He knows exactly what he's doing. He plays his hand very well. No one should expect that Vladimir Putin will do anything other than what will keep him as king for the foreseeable future. He has a presidential election in 2018. maybe he'll get 96 instead of 98% of the vote. I don't think we would call it a free and fair election. Yes, there are times when one can work with Russia, but now is not the time. Russia is pushing against our European allies, partners, and friends, against the Baltics, in Europe. He is indeed trying to gin things up in Syria. Yes, his alliance with Iran and Syria is a very bad thing. And yes, we should do everything we can to push Iran back from that malicious and unbelievably horrific action. But Russia is not a good actor on the world stage today. And it is sort of disturbing, quite frankly, that there were 4,000 people at the St. Petersburg Forum over the last few days, treating him as if he is a normal player on the world stage. And finally, the very fact, Michael, that you would leave any space to believe that Russia didn't try to affect our election.
I didn't say that.
Well, do you believe that Russia tried to interfere with our election?
I believe that they hacked Podesta's emails in a phishing expedition. He handed them his password.
And you think they did nothing else?
I hear the hissing. I don't know. I don't believe, as Hillary Clinton said last week, that American insiders helped the Russians to in an information campaign.
I'm gonna go
against her, right. which the clear implication is that the Trump campaign gave Putin advice about how to shape his message so as to win the election.
I'm going to go with 17 intelligence agencies who are neither Democrats nor Republicans.
I'm going to go with John Brennan, who is a Democrat, who in his recent testimony said there's no evidence of collusion.
No, I didn't speak to the conclusion.
You know what?
I didn't speak to the collusion issue. What I'm speaking to is I didn't say who they were trying to affect, though I have my own views about that. But the 17 intelligence agencies said without a doubt that Russia interfered with our election, and it appeared from their analysis that they did so, at least towards the end, to advantage Donald Trump. I have no idea.
I do. I know exactly
I have no idea whether there was collusion. That is why Robert Mueller is doing the work he's doing, and that's why I hope the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee does their work. We need to know what happened. We need to know what happened, not because it's going to give us a different president of the United States. We have who we have, though I must say the other side got 3 million more of the popular vote. But that set aside,
I know.
It is important. It is important that we find out what happened. That's why Robert Mueller's investigation is not enough. We need the Senate and we need the House, because we can never have a foreign power interfere in our election again.
All right, great.
Mike, a few seconds, and then I'd like to go to closing remarks.
I gotta make.
And then we'll take it outside.
I gotta make two points. 2 points. One is that I do know what Putin was doing, and I'll share it with you now so that we don't need all these investigations. Putin had no ability to predict the outcome of our election that was better than any of our best observers. Putin didn't have a crystal ball that helped him understand anything better than Nate Silver, who told us that Hillary Clinton was going to win. So to the extent that he engaged in an information operation against us, and I don't doubt that he did, I just believe that the impact of that has been greatly exaggerated. And again, Reed shattered to find out how Hillary Clinton was running her campaign. But what he was trying to do was to tarnish President Hillary Clinton and to tarnish our institutions and to spread dissension among us, so that she would be a weakened president. That was the goal of the information information operation. And secondly, I do hope that we will find out everything in this investigation. And one of the things that I hope that we will find out about is the Obama surveillance of the Trump campaign. You don't want to...
Please.
Thank you. Thank you. I won't go into great detail. Let me just direct your attention to one thing only. January 12th, 2017, David Ignatius opinion piece in the Washington Post, in which he says that a senior Obama official told him about the contents of the conversation between Mike Flynn and Kislyak, and he also suggests that the official thought that it demonstrated collusion between he suggests that it demonstrates collusion between the Trump administration and the Russians. That's secret intel. There's the evidence for you right there. That's the DNA at the crime scene. That's top secret surveillance information taken out of foreign policy channels, moved into political channels, spread into our press in support of the collusion lie. That's a misuse of surveillance. It's a misuse of surveillance information, and it's a crime. And it's the only crime that we know of so far that has been committed within this framework of Russia and Trump. And I surely hope that all these investigations will also look into that leak, which, as I say, was a crime and an abuse of power.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, now, recalling the title of this session, which is America First Advancing or Compromising U.S. Interests Abroad? We're going to conclude. I'm going to ask for, I know, it's hard to imagine that we're leaving.
Is it tomorrow yet?
I'm going to ask Ambassador Sherman for first remarks, and then Mike Doran.
Thank you, and thank you all for your rapt attention and for your enthusiastic engagement in this debate. I guess what I want to say is it's really important to have these debates. It is important for AJC to continue the work that it does, not just here in the United States, but around the world. AJC is above all else an international organization because AJC has understood to stop anti-Semitism, to support Israel, to make sure that we never have another Holocaust ever again, that we need to engage in the world and not isolate ourselves from the world. The last time America did that, you all know the results. I am blessed to have 2 little grandsons. And if I could, I'd spend every single day with them. I'm sure some of you out there feel the same way about your grandkids. Then I'm glad to give them back to their parents. But I worry for them. Because in the world in which we're living, we're creating a moat around us. We're pulling up the drawbridge to the rest of the world. My daughter is an immigration asylum attorney, helps run the clinic at Boston University. And day after day, young people who are afraid they're going to be deported stop talking to the police. Stop talking to law enforcement. Stop talking to any official for fear for their families and for their lives. That kind of fear, that kind of isolationism from the world, never in history has it bred anything good. Never. We teach our children, I hope, and I know AJC does, to understand the world. That doesn't mean we don't stand up for our interests. Of course we do. But even when kids are on a playground, even when they are competing at soccer, at the end of the game, we ask them to walk down the line and shake hands. Because it is a community that is playing that game, not just 2 opposing sides competing. Now, I understand that President Trump was a very successful developer. Right after the election, as I was going through Dulles Airport, which I do on a constant basis, I picked up The Art of the Deal and I read it. But negotiating to build a building is not the same as being president. If a building doesn't get built, people just go by someplace else and you build another building. If you don't work for peace in the world, you have war, death, and destruction. I'm all for disruption, but I am not for destruction.
Thank you, Wendy. Mike Doran, I think you have the last word.
A British political analyst at a think tank called Policy Exchange named David Goodhart has developed some concepts that I think are useful for understanding the world we're in today. He talks about anywhere people and somewhere people. Anywhere people are extremely, he developed this idea to talk about the Brexit vote in Britain, but I think it applies all across the West. Anywhere people are highly educated, mobile, they are flexible, and not rooted in any particular place. They are software engineers, media professionals, and working in New York, Los Angeles, London, Paris. If they lose their job in New York, they can move to Los Angeles. If they lose their job in Los Angeles, they can move to New York. They can move to London. They value the globalist ideology and the globalist agenda of our foreign policy elite. In fact, they are our foreign policy elite. The anywhere people are the people who have been running the country, running Britain and running America for the last 2 decades. Somewhere people are rooted in a particular place, Pittsburgh, anywhere in one of those red states from New York to California. They're less educated, they're less mobile, and they're concerned about their communities. The somewhere people won the vote in the last election, and they're going to continue to win the votes. The changes that we're seeing in the foreign policy of the Trump administration would have happened, I firmly believe, in a Clinton administration, and even more in a Sanders administration. What we witnessed in the last election was a tectonic shift. And we, as people who are committed to American engagement in the world, need to be doing the hard intellectual work of thinking how to remain engaged and yet meet the needs of the somewhere people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Hey.
And that concludes this great debate. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sherman. Thank you, Mike Doran. We'll see you next year in Jerusalem.
Thank you.